G'day folks, welcome back to part 2 of our Schumacher Cougar 2 Works Classic build and review. So in part 1 we did the unboxing, we took a little bit of a look inside the box and we talked a little bit about the history of the car. Here in part 2 we're going to do the build, but before we do the build, look at this beautiful thing. I'm going to come back at the end and talk a little bit about what we've got in front of us here, but look at it, it's finished. With no further ado, let's cut to the build, a bit of a time lapse. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I found interesting in the build. And then at the end, we'll come back and wrap this bad boy up. Remember part 3, that's when we get this thing dirty. You know it, in Australia, we race off-road on dirt. That's where this bad boy is going to get its work. But for now, let's go take a look at the build and see what we found.
So let's talk you through this build of the Schumacher Cougar 2 Classic Works, the 1992 buggy re-released in 2025. It's pretty logical front to rear kind of a build. Starts off here with the front suspension. You can follow along. The one thing I did do, which I'll confess to you, is that there are some washers that fit under those little circlips on the front hinge pins. I forgot to put those in. So I went back and did that. One little trick that might be useful for you with circlips is that you can actually assemble the components inside a large plastic bag if you're having trouble with those circlips pinging off, flying off into your workshop. Schumacher do provide some spares in the kit for you. I've assembled 1,000 or more of those circlips over the years, so you can see those fine little needle nose pliers on the right there, and that I use to assemble the circlips without too much trouble at all. The uprights on the right and left of that front suspension do, including the instructions, a little washer to sit under the circlip, top and bottom. I found them a little bit too tight, so I left the bottom washer off. You can see how your kit goes together, but that is one option to consider. The other thing I'm going to confess to you is that I did assemble the steering and the bulkheads in the wrong order. So we're going to get to that in just a moment, where all of the steering and bulkheads go together. The whole thing bolts together. I bolted the chassis, the front suspension and the steering bulkhead together, and then had to pull it all apart. Get the steering in there, as you can see, under that front bulkhead, and then attach the front suspension to the car. Steering comes with full ball bearings, which is really nice. Front axles are ball raced as well. Of course, it is a single ball bearing out in those front hubs. There is an option part available to change it over to a dual bearing front hub to give a little more support to the front axle. Something that I think we probably did back in the day, and you can definitely do that now. Lovely carbon pieces. Here we're putting the front shock tower together. I did opt to build the kit completely out of the box, so didn't change over any of the hardware. So that means a lot of posi-drive Phillips head style screws. Have a look in the manual. It will give you the instructions on exactly the right screwdriver to get. Well worth getting the right thing. There is a difference between Phillips head and posi-drive. Make sure you get the right size and shape of screwdriver. Another friend of mine has already built his car and changed as much of the hardware as he could over to hex head screws, and that's another way to go. But for, good old school, I wanted to go with the standard hardware. I've said before, I'm using Mark 1 servos and batteries in my car, and so here we're putting the tiny little Mark 1. It's absolutely gorgeous, this little servo, and so it's fitted in really nicely in there at the front of the setup. And I did build that kit servo saver. I think you could probably, with a modern servo, get away with a solid servo arm, and I might well change to that later, but for the sake of building what came in the box, I did opt to put in the standard servo saver. Once the front of the car is all together, and it really goes together reasonably straightforward, we move on to the rear of the car. This is one of the big differences between the original Cougar 2 team and the Works version. This rear suspension geometry is different, mounts are a little bit different, rear uprights are a little bit different, but it all goes together in a reasonably straightforward kind of a fashion. Nothing too challenging or too difficult. Again, I stuck with the kit hardware. I don't really enjoy building turnbuckles, but if you use the supplied little fiberglass wrench, glass fiber wrench, it's actually not too bad. You can get another wrench on the center of the turnbuckle and you then use that supplied wrench to wind the ball end on. Really, at this point, we've got the rear shock tower on, rear suspension, major components, arms, and the turnbuckles built and so on. And then we start to get into the heart of the car, the transmission, belt drive, of course, ball differential, made famous by Cecil Schumacher, kind of inventing or adapting and inventing the ball differential for his son Robin's car right back in, I think it's the late 70s or early 80s. If you track down an Action RC podcast episode where we spoke to Robin Schumacher, he tells us that story about that first ball differential that was being built for the cars he was running in a parking lot with a bunch of mates. How quickly that turned into orders from other friends and a little business was born, and so it goes. Beautiful differential, goes together really nicely. Old school style. Then we get to one of the really funky parts of the car, these little alloy roller drive shafts. Absolutely beautiful. One little trick here is to make sure there's a little spacer that seats down inside that outer body. Make sure that really seats in nicely. I ended up using a 5.5mm nut driver to really seat that in well. If you don't get that seated down far enough, the inner and outer parts of the drive shaft don't join together too well. Don't ask me how I know that. I spent quite a few minutes trying to figure that out. So seating that spacer down inside with a nut driver just helps you work out how to get those drive shafts together. They're an absolute work of art. The little rollers inside can be upgraded or replaced with tiny little bearings. I don't think I'll go to that extent just yet. Nicely greased. Should give plenty of lubrication. And you can pull the whole thing apart, clean it out, re-grease it. Change over those little rollers if you need to. Now, this is one of the parts of the car that lots of people don't really enjoy, and I've got to tell you that it took me a little while to work out, or to remember, really, that muscle memory, how to do that. I did try hot water, didn't really like it, tried the fiberglass tool that comes with the car, struggled with that a little bit. So I changed over here to actually a Schumacher turnbuckle wrench that I had. I used the 3.9mm end. It's a little thinner than, you can see those fiberglass tools over just there on my left. And I pre-flexed the little ears, the plastic ears, with a pair of pliers. So I bent them out a little bit, just got them working and flexing, and then using that tool, you can see it there on the screen. The drive shafts in the end went together quite well. So it took me about 10 minutes to work that out. Once I did, the whole lot went together in a couple of minutes. Then we start to get onto the insides of the gearbox. And the Cougar 2 and the Cougar and the Top Cat really were unique for their day with a belt drive transmission. There was one car around from Kyosho, I think, that had a belt drive transmission and some aftermarket conversions for RC10s, things like that. Hyperdrive was one that used to put a belt drive on the outside of an RC10 gearbox. But as far as sticking with it, Schumacher really did from 1988 through the 4 years of the Top Cat Cougar 2 platform. So we kind of get into the heart of what is a pretty conventional, at least for Schumacher, gearbox, alloy side plates, a plastic bulkhead that holds it all apart. This is one area where having exactly the right kind of screwdriver to get those tiny little screws into the eccentric bearing housing that lets you adjust belt tension later on, but the right kind of screwdriver to get those tiny little screws right in there. And then really it's just a matter of kind of getting everything lined up. We're finding all the parts, the little bearing seat that goes on the end of the lay shaft, and a little bit fiddly for the first couple of minutes to work it out, and then through it goes. Then it's really the same kind of in the other direction. Once you've got all the pieces in and settled, then the other side plate goes on, you screw it all into place. I did take to using a cordless screwdriver a little bit once I'd started some screws off by hand. Then I'd use the cordless driver to kind of do the bulk of the work. But that's really the gearbox. It goes together. And then there's this, I've got to say, I'm not a big fan of this two-piece dust cover. I do wish we just had a solid outer kind of dust cover, typical of a two-wheel drive, but we kind of cut and grind and try to fit this backing part of the dust cover on. Then the slipper clutch, it's single pad slipper as we used back in the day. There are some option parts and an option lay shaft and so on available to bring it to a more modern kind of clutch standard. One little bit in the instructions actually that's helpful is to pay attention to here is an extra bolt and washer and nut provided to seat the spacers right down inside that clutch housing. So just have a little look at the instructions there and follow that through. And there you can see it all put together. Car ships with a 95 tooth spare. I've talked about that before. If you're running spec brushless motors, you'll need to find something a little bit smaller, maybe 86 or 89 to get down to a gear ratio, particularly if you're running 21.5, which in Australia is the kind of default vintage two-wheel drive spec motor. that's certainly what I will be doing eventually when we get this car on track. Despite what you'll see a little later in this build video, we will go to a 21.5 brushless motor. We're just finishing off the rear of the car here. These are the Works specific uprights. One thing I had completely forgotten but was reminded in this build is those outer hinge pins are so tiny. I think they're probably 2 millimeters in diameter compared to a more standard 3 mil hinge pin that's used throughout the rest of the suspension. It's a beautiful car, and you can, even when I got to this point without the shock absorbers, kind of sat and stared at it for a while, took a few photos. And then we moved on to the shocks, the Vari shocks. The party piece for these shock absorbers is the pistons that you can set to 1, 2, 3, or 4 holes open. But interestingly, in the kit, there is solid pistons provided as well. So you can choose whether to use those Vari pistons or not. I chose for the solid pistons. My memory from back in the day is that we almost always used 3-hole pistons. So I kind of went, oh, look, we'll start with that. Start with the kit fluids and a solid 3-hole piston. And if I want to play around with that a little bit later on, I can. The other thing to note here is that you see all those mouldings on the right-hand side of my board there, and they're all leftovers. And that's because they look like they're mouldings for perhaps a touring car. It did make me wonder whether sometime down the track we might see a Mission, the re-release of a Mission touring car, Schumacher's, or the SST 2000. I think that might have been the first, and then the Mission came a little bit later on. After a while, I realised all those parts were not needed for this build, and so you'll see them disappear off my board. It's a bottom-loading shock absorber. You build up those cartridges, little foam volume compensators, a couple of seals. There are probably some optional seals available for a little bit less stiction. We used to use white seals back in the day. They leaked a little, but they were silky smooth. The red seals standard then and now. Shocks went together pretty nicely. You're kind of bleeding a little bit of oil out as you go. And then we get to the springs. I think I've said before, I kind of wish we had the brightly coloured springs of the 90s for this build, but these feel like really nice springs. I did feed the supplied heat shrink onto the springs so that when I get a full spring kit available, I'll be able to differentiate between the different springs. And then it's really a matter of getting the shocks onto the car, and we're not too far away from a finished chassis. Couple of nuts that hold things in place, some little plastic ball that sits inside the shock end, and on we go. I went pretty much the standard kit build settings on the shock positions. I did go down 1 hole in the front shocks because we'll be running outdoors on dirt on a rough track, so I went for a little bit more droop there. Here I'm bolting in a Peak Performance 11 quad. Gotta love a great motor, don't you, like that? Like a 11 quad, a 12 single, a 13 double, something like that. Those of you who raced back in the 90s will be kind of nodding your head and agreeing with me. Those who've come along a little bit later will be going, we have no idea what you're talking about. But I did bolt an 11 quad into the car just for some photos, and hopefully I do have a Novak Tempest speed control, so maybe we'll bolt that in and let that little 11 quad sing. From there, then, it was to have a little look at battery mounting using a LiPo shorty pack. Actually, the pack I had on hand here is the ultra low center of gravity pack, the ULCG pack from Mach 1. And that actually is not going to fit with the standard battery mount. So there is an optional battery mount that to let you run your kind of ULCG batteries. I'll probably switch over to a full height pack, partly because, as I say, I'm going to run the car on dirt. Low grip and a little bit more weight over the rear of the car would be a good thing. Here we're getting rid of the kit tyres. If you're running on Astro or grass or some of those things, those kit tyres will be great. But we race on dirt. Asphalt is for parking, dirt is for racing. So here in Australia, it's all dirt, and so I'm going for some classic rib front and mini pin rear tyres. I think they're J Concepts on the front and perhaps Jetco on the rear. The kind of tyres I could easily get my hands on locally. And that'll kind of get us going. And that about brings us to the end of the build. I thoroughly enjoyed the process. I think the colour of the chassis and the alloy parts is beautiful. It's not a modern car, and when you build one of these, you realise just how far the technology has come. But look at it. Look at it there, the beautiful purple. And maybe those modern electronics, that gorgeous little Mach 1 servo does kind of make the car look just a little bit more special. So that's the build. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Let's see if we can wrap up with a few closing thoughts.
So that's the Schumacher Cougar 2 Works Classic build, the re-release, just out at the end of 2024. First released the car right back in 1992, late 92, early 93, right around there. I really enjoyed the build. It's been a lot of fun. I love the body shell that's on this car. I can't claim the credit for it. It's been painted by Tony Gray, paint and graphics by TFG here in Australia. Tony's a mate from way back. I sent him a photo of one of my cars from the mid-90s and said, see what you can do. And this is what he's produced, beautiful body shell. Really looking forward to getting this car on the racetrack. We've got a couple of jobs to finish off. Got to get some electronics inside it. Picked up this morning the Hobby Wing Just Stock Speed Control from Speedy RC here in Brisbane, Australia. So Speedy RC, the Hobby Wing will go in, and a 21.5 brushless motor. That's really how we run vintage two-wheel drive here in Australia. I do still, of course, have that Peak 11 quad bolted into the back of the car for the photos. I'm not sure I'm going to be brave enough to run that. I don't really want to wreck the motor. It's something that's special to me. I want to kind of keep it on the shelf, but you never know. We might give that a run. For now, though, that's the car. That's the build. It's almost ready to go. Just those electronics to go on board. Chargers RC here in Brisbane, Australia, just about finished the brand new vintage-friendly dirt track, specially built for vintage and a little bit of modern dirt running. We're really looking forward to getting on track there in a few weeks' time. We've also got another really old-school dirt track here in Brisbane in Australia. It's called the Boondall Entertainment Centre, a track that was actually built right back in the 1980s and has been untouched ever since. Just gets a little bit of a clean-up every now and then, but the layout, the jumps, the dirt is all the same. We'll probably try and get this one out there as well for a little bit of a run. That is really loose, sandy, old-school dirt. Not what this car's designed for, but we'll make it work. Thanks for being with me for the shoot, for the build, and I look forward to seeing you back in a few weeks' time when we get to run this car and bring you some stories about how it goes out there on the dirt. Thanks for being with me.